Next up, we have a session led by the ArchivesSpace Core Committers Group on considering, implementing, and maintaining plugins and other customizations in ArchivesSpace. In this session, members of the ArchivesSpace Core Committers Group will discuss key considerations when creating, maintaining, and using plugins and other customizations in ArchivesSpace. ArchivesSpace Tech Lead Brian Hoffman will kick off the presentation with information about how and why you may consider using plugins with ArchivesSpace. Core Committer Joshua Shaw of Dartmouth College will then discuss considerations for maintaining and updating plugins. After, join the Core Committers in a discussion about plugins and other customizations, documentation, and how to best implement plugins. All right, Brian, if you want to start us off.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Hoffman, Tech Lead for ArchivesSpace, and we're going to talk today about plugins. Joshua is going to do most of the presentation and kind of overview of plugins for us, and together we're going to try to answer any specific questions anyone might have about plugins. It looks like, am I reading correctly that Alicia's our only kind of guest right now?
No, we've got about 240 people
here.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
All right, sorry. I'm just seeing a weird Zoom thing. So, all right, never mind then. So for those who don't know, ArchivesSpace has a, since the beginning, it's had a plugin architecture that is been evolving the whole time. It's somewhat documented through the Tech Docs site, but there are lots of kind of things that it's easiest to understand by just looking at other plugins and kind of following the model. That's something I myself would do if I were developing a plugin. And it mostly works by matching directories and file names to existing directories and file names in ArchivesSpace. So the way that plugins are structured is very significant in terms of the directory structure, and they also have some kind of special named files like initialization files that are invoked when ArchivesSpace begins to run. And with plugins, you can do a lot of things. You can customize the schemas that ArchivesSpace data model runs on. You can do database migrations. You can customize indexing. You can customize presentation in the public application or the front-end application with some limitations. And you can also add job or add anything like jobs or ARC minters or any kind of thing that ArchivesSpace does on a kind of registry based like a system of registered job runner type things.
Brian?
Yeah.
Are there any slides?
Well, I think I'm gonna hand over to Joshua at this point.
Okay, cool.
To talk more about this.
Okay, so yes, and I do have a few slides. Unfortunately, let me share my screen here. Right. Okay, so let's just go into presenter mode here. And I hope everybody can see my screen. So basically, I'm Joshua Shaw from Dartmouth. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what you should consider when you're developing and maintaining plugins. So as Brian said, you can do a lot of different things with plugin. Some can be very simple. Some can be very complex. So that's sort of the first thing that you want to think about is, what are you doing? Are you doing something simple? And by simple, typically you're talking about minor changes to the UI. So you might want to change a color in the staff view or the public interface. You might want to change a label somewhere. Those are pretty simple things that you can override pretty quickly. Sort of the next level of complexity is, are you adding data, like a simple subrecord to an existing object? So do you want to add another piece of data to, say, a resource or an accession? There are lots more complex things you can do. Like Brian was saying, you can add reports. Those aren't typically that complex. You can add background jobs. Obviously, background jobs can be as simple or as complex as you need them to be. You can also, if you're really feeling ambitious, you can add new top-level objects to ArchivesSpace. So something that's the equivalent of a resource or an accession or something like that. So you can do everything from very small to fairly complex stuff. You can also do integrations with other systems. That's another thing that you might consider when you want to use a plugin. So as you're thinking about this, sort of the complexity of the project that you're thinking about dictates what you're going to want to think about as far as what pieces you're going to want to need to add to the plugin. So you're going to need to add schema, extensions or new schemas for the existing data that you're adding. Do you need database migrations? Do you need new model information in the back end? Do you need additional controllers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And some of this, you need some familiarity with Rails and Ruby on Rails and how those things work and some of the naming conventions. So you need a bit of a background there. Other things you can do is you can add to the indexer. Like if you need additional data for, say, a change in a view that would be easier to get from an already, prefabbed indexer field. Do you want to add faceting, which you also need to sort of tinker with the indexer typically? And then there are considerations for the PUI because that runs a slightly different application or different Railsy application layer. So some of the ways that you need to deal with the PUI are slightly different from the staff view. So here's some examples of what sort of plugins, and as you're thinking about this. So something that adds a new subrecord to an accession, for example, that's a plugin that adds functionality. If you wanted to change the EAD export, for example, that's going to be overriding functionality that's in the core code. And then you can typically have a mix of both of those where you add functionality, but you're also doing something else with that new data, perhaps, that's going to affect some of the core views, for example. So resources, this is really the heart of everything, is how do you figure out how to do all this stuff? And as Brian said, a lot of this is really find existing plugins, look for a plugin that does something similar or is a similar workflow or a similar data model, and figure out how that plugin is interacting with the core code. So I've listed some resources here that I typically go to. So there's the tech docs, which sort of gives you a brief overview of plugin structure. That's good to sort of familiarize yourself with where things work, how things work, and where you should be looking, sort of in a general way. Awesome ArchivesSpace gives you an overview of some of the integrations and other plugins that are out there. So that's a good sort of overall list. Where I typically go is go to Hudson Molonglo's repository. They're one of the original, or they are the original developers of ArchivesSpace, and they've been actively working with other institutions to develop additional functionality. Dartmouth was one of those. So I typically go there to take a look to see if they've gotten any, they have any repo that does things similar to what I'm looking to do. And another one, the Queensland State Archives, they also feature a bunch of work from HM, as I'm going to abbreviate that because I know I'm going to mispronounce Molonglo at some point. That's another good resource. And then in the core repo, there's also a plugins directory where you can take a look at some of the examples there. And then there's also looking at other peer institutions that have done work. And a lot of those are listed in Awesome ArchivesSpace, but some of them are not. So it's also always good to do a Google search of like plugins, ArchivesSpace, whatever the institution is, perhaps, or just plugins ArchivesSpace. So you're going to want to think about what, planning for the plugin, which is, and this is pretty standard for any project that you'd want to do. Plan out the workflow, figure out what additional data you need. If you're going to need to add data, you're going to need to add some bits and pieces that are going to be standard. So you're going to need to add data migrations, models, controllers for that data, all that sort of good stuff. You probably need to add new views as well if you're going to be displaying the data. I talked about indexer modifications. Those are typically optional, but again, they can be useful for depending on what you're needing to do. And then you also need to figure out whether you need to override or extend things in the core code itself. And then basically you're at the stage of where you need to actually start writing code. And this is where having a model plugin is really useful, because you can refer to that and say, okay, here's sort of the boilerplate-ish sort of approach. This plugin is doing something similar. I can adapt this to what I need to do. And then I usually start by doing sort of the data side of things and the model side of things by adding to the database, getting the models going, data migration schemas, all those sorts of things. Then once I've got the data model in a good place, then I start usually working on the controllers and the views to actually manipulate that data. And then it's a lot of test it, fix it, and keep going. So that's sort of the overview of what I think about when I'm developing a plugin. And obviously that's a very high level simplified view of things. The sort of corollary to that is, what do you do when you upgrade ArchivesSpace? What are the sorts of things you need to think about with the plugins that you have already running in your ArchivesSpace instance? So again, this is going to be pretty similar to what you think about when you develop a plugin, but there are some shortcuts that you can kind of take sometimes. Typically, and this is typically as in most of the time, but it's not a rule. Schemas, migrations, and models probably won't need fixing, but again, you need to check. Check the views. These are where I typically find most of the changes that I need to make are, especially if you're overriding core views, because core views can change and you want to make sure that your override or your addition to the core view is still present, but that any new functionality that's in that view is also in your plugin. And then you need to check the initializers, the controllers, any helpers that you've written, all those sorts of things, especially again, if you're overriding any core methods in any of those. And then the final thing you need to think about is, has any of the underlying technology changed? Has Rails had an upgrade? Those sorts of things. So a little bit about some of the specifics. Again, for views, it kind of depends on what you're doing exactly. If you're just adding subrecords to the staff side, you probably don't have a lot to think about, because those tend to be pretty self-contained. If you're overriding a staff view, then again, you need to check the core code, see if those views have changed, and merge your plugin view with the core code view. And then for the PUI, same sort of mentality of checking those things. Controllers, again, if it's a self-contained sort of data model that you're talking about, like just a subrecord, chances are pretty good that you probably won't need to make a lot of changes. But again, you need to check. If you're override or extending core code, that's where you really need to dig in and make sure that what you're doing isn't conflicting with the core code, and that the core code hasn't added any new functionality that you need to incorporate. PUI has a few little extra things that you need to think about. You can override the PDF exports, for example, in views in the PUI. So again, that's an extra section that you need to think about and check to make sure that those things haven't changed in the core code. And if you're overriding them, that your overrides are merged in with core code changes. So other pieces that you need to think about, again, models, migrations, schemas, all those good sorts of things. And again, it's unlikely that you'll need to change those unless you're overriding or extending core functionality. And code that deals with exports, because that's almost always going to be an override, that's another place where you're going to need to think about what you've done versus what core has done, and make sure that to reconcile any changes there. And then another thing to think about is underlying technology changes. So good example of this is when we upgraded from 2.80 to 2.8.1, that included a Rails update. And that changed the way that params, which are passed around, were treated. So you had to explicitly allow some of those, depending on where you were looking at them. the biggie, test it. Before doing any updates, make sure that you test your plugins against a non-production instance of ArchivesSpace. Just to make sure that you're not breaking things, you're not ruining your data, all the things that you need to be aware of when you're doing any update sort of goes doubly if you have custom plugins running there. Personally, I have a local development instance that I test in, and then we have actually 3 environments, server environments. We have a development environment, we have a pre-production, and then a production environment. And we go through testing in each of those to make sure that, you know, I catch it locally. If I don't, then somebody else in dev catches it. And then if they don't, then in pre-prod for sort of final QA, it gets caught there. Not to say that we don't miss a few things here and there, but that gets all the biggies. That's it for me as far as the presentation. I'm hoping that we get a lot of questions that we can sort of talk about. And I'll go back over to the presentation then. Or back to the conversation, rather.
Thanks, Joshua. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A about maybe if you're considering developing a plugin. If you have any questions, this is a great place to ask to get a little bit of insight there. Or if you are maybe trying to find a plugin or have any questions about implementing someone else's plugin, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A.
And I'll chime in and say it's a complicated space to work in, and so I know when I was starting out, it was a bit intimidating trying to figure these things out. So don't feel shy if you have something that you might consider a simple question, because it's nothing simple.
Yeah, and likewise, if people are working on plugins, I think the best advice now, even more than looking at documentation and other plugins, is just to get in touch with either the core committers or the ArchivesSpace team, or just the general community to get help with what you're trying to do. Because if you're starting from scratch, it could be kind of not obvious how to do it.
To that end, there's a question in the chat. Would you offer a suggestion of tools to use for beginners? So someone that just wants to start programming these plugins.
Yeah, so I would say that first you probably want to get a local instance of ArchivesSpace up and running, because you really need that to start writing these things and debugging. After that, probably basic familiarity with Ruby and Rails would be good, and that's pretty much whatever floats your boat as far as how you prefer to learn about those sorts of things. You know, Stack Overflow is a good place for specifics, and even for some very general things. There's always the sort of documentation for Ruby and for Rails, you know, if you're looking for a specific method or something like that. And then have some sort of development environment that you prefer to use. You know, something even as simple as a text editor that you prefer. And I personally switch off on and off. Right now I'm using Atom as my editor for a very specific tool. But that's changed. You know, I've used BBEdit, I've used Eclipse, you know, I use Oxygen. It just depends on the day and the job, sort of.
And I would just add too that you could develop a plugin using the distributed ArchivesSpace, and it's good to test plugins that way. But if you're developing a plugin, you'll be much better off working in the development environment as described in the tech doc site, where you set up a development server for the back end and for the front end.
And I think Corey may have dropped that page in the chat. We have a question in the Q&A, but someone did ask a question in the chat, so let me go back to that. Do we have a central place that lists the plugins that humans have created? I had a challenge recently importing EAD3 records, ended up writing some local code to change my EAD records to EAD 2002. I think that's a good question. Joshua, you mentioned it very briefly, but if I'm looking for plugins, where is there a central place, or where should I be looking?
Yeah, so the awesome ArchivesSpace list is a good start. It is not exhaustive though. So as far as I know, there's no one central place that lists everything, and it's more a question of the things that I've listed in the slides. HM's repos are really, really useful. Harvard, Yale, all the, sort of every institution that has done some work, typically you're able to sort of Google around and find their repos. But again, it would be nice to have some central listing of that. Of course, then there's the maintenance of that list that has to be considered.
Thanks. Is it possible to add dependency gems using plugins? If so, is that a terrible idea?
It is possible. It's only a terrible idea if you do something that's going to conflict with the gems that are loaded into core. So you just need to be cautious about making sure that the versions that you specify in your gem dependencies match those for core.
Thanks. Are there minimums or maximums of plugins that you can use in ArchivesSpace?
Not as far as I know. If you're talking about the number of plugins that you can run, the answer to that is as few or as many as you want. Depending on what you're doing in the plugins, you may need to bump your memory requirements for the main application. But that's kind of the only thing I can think of that would be a limitation. Maybe Brian knows a little bit more about that one, but
I don't think there's any like known limitation, but I've never heard of anyone using like many plugins. You can also specify inter-plugin dependencies in the config files for your plugin. So you can say that your plugin depends on another plugin, if that's the case.
yeah, we're actually doing that with a few of our plugins where, we started out with one sort of base layer sort of functionality and then built on that, but it didn't seem right necessarily to use the same plugin space for that new functionality. I'm reconsidering a lot of that because our local plugins, just as sort of background, have grown to the point where they're so interconnected in spots that now it probably makes more sense for them all to be in one plugin, or at least a bunch of them.
Kevin asks, I'm curious if anyone, either Joshua or Brian or anyone in the audience, has a strategy for managing the file overrides in one's plugins so you can track what changes across releases and quickly recognize when you might need to keep up with them.
That's a really good question. And the answer to that is no, I have not found a good way to keep a list of things that basically says, okay, you only need to check here, here, and here. Typically what I do is I look, like I said in the slides, I look through the views because those are the ones that tend to be the places that get changed the most. And then typically plugin init for either the staff or the PUI is where I tend to anyway place most of the overrides. So that's the other place that I tend to look.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is like one of the more frustrating areas of the plugins, which is that we've never really like formalized a way to track how plugins like what versions of ArchivesSpace they are developed for and support. And we don't really have a good way to like test plugins against updates to ArchivesSpace. So hopefully in the future, maybe there will be some more evolution there.
Yeah, and if anyone has any insight, feel free to drop it in the chat. Lisa says she likes interdependencies for a solution. Thank you. And then checking in the chat. Seth says, I'll just mention that I'm glad to see Docker Compose files have been added for setting up local development.
Yeah, we that's one of the things that I run. I typically run bare metal sort of when I'm doing the initial development, but then I will go over to a Docker container for final testing because we're running all of our other instances in Docker. So that, and I've run into a few places where what I've done without the Docker container works, but then moving into the Docker container breaks. Very rare, but it's happened. So it's good to have those additional testing instances. And it's nice to have the compose files ready as well.
Seth says, we are the reverse. I do a lot of dev in Docker, but all of our production are bare metal.
The Docker Compose files, I think the ones you're referring to, they just give you the option now to not really have to worry about setting up MySQL and Solr locally if you want to start developing. But you can still do those things if you want. Although you would have to change some of the settings in the configuration.
Thanks. All right, we're all caught up in the chat. No, we're not. As soon as I say that, I should just say it more. Are there any questions you tend to ask yourself to determine if this is a bad idea before developing a plugin for a specific local need? That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. I typically, when I'm thinking about it, I try to think about, is there a way that the existing core functionality can be used to do what I want to do? So even if it's not exactly the way that, say, the help docs say that you should use this, can you change, basically develop a local workflow that would use some of the core structure to do what you need to do? After that, it's really sort of a cost benefit analysis of mainly around maintenance. If what you're trying to do is a fairly simple override, then I don't see an issue with doing whatever you think you need to do in a plugin. If it's fairly complex, then you really need to think about how much maintenance time are you willing to devote, or do you have to devote to keeping it up to date with ArchivesSpace as ArchivesSpace evolves. That to me is sort of the core question about plugins, is the maintenance.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. All right, we're caught up on the chat again. Nothing happened that time. All right, I'm going to speak really slowly in case anyone else is typing a question. If you do have a question about plugins, any considerations for plugins, please feel free to drop those in now. Now is your chance to ask any burning question you've ever had about plugins. If not, we'll go ahead and go to our break a little bit early. I do want to make sure, Brian and Joshua, is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap up this session?
I'm going to drop my email in the chat, and I'm happy to answer questions offline if I have the answer. The other thing I would say is that even though the listserv tends to be more process oriented, there have been questions on there about development, and people tend to chime in, maybe not as frequently as they would for sort of workflow and process questions, but that's another resource that people might want to use.
And I'll add that the development channel on the ArchivesSpace Slack is not very active, but that I think that would also be a good place to talk about plugins or get help with the technical details of plugins.
All right, thank you both. Joshua did just drop his email into the chat. And like he said, if you are from an ArchivesSpace member institution and you are signed up for the listserv, feel free to post your questions there. If you're not signed up for the listserv, sign up. And you can always get help that way. And we'll make sure that a copy of the slides are also included on the program wiki. So all of those great resources and links that Joshua included there will be available to you when those slides come up.